Welcome back to Module 1, Introduction to Project Scope Management. In this module, we will discuss the key components of developing your project scope management. We also discuss the history of project management and scope management, the importance of scope management, why scope management often been kind of overlooked in the process, and why most projects pay the price at the end because they forgot to pay attention and collect the requirements. Because what it's saying here is that most projects failed at the beginning and not in the middle and not at the end. We fail to identify our scope, gather requirements, and then document those requirements and prioritize the requirement, build our work breakdown structure. So if you don't do it at the scope level, any issue we see is going to be kind of built upon what we already started at the beginning. So that's why it's so important to pay attention to the scope management area. All right, so let's just go directly into the components of that. And so the module 1, which is the introduction to project scope management, has 2 parts. So the first part covers 3 points. One is the importance of project scope management for your projects and how they are important, how they are critical for the success of your project. And the second one is there are some signs that your organization has poor scope management techniques. We will go over about 10 signs that shows that a weakness in your project scope management strategy within your organization. And of course, we will talk about the history of project scope management, because it did not start yesterday. The history goes back to 1,000 years, because project has been performed as long as mankind exists. So we will cover all these 3 pieces in the part 1 of your introduction to project scope management. Now, before we go there, let's just talk about why do we care? Why is scope management important? Because the field of project scope management seems to be one of the most neglected domains in project management. Because if you are an executive, or if you have worked with the project, you may probably know that once the budget is approved, then people just jump to estimate the cost and to estimate the schedule and just move on. Because they'll say that, well, we'll figure it out as we move on. That's not true. So that's why oftentimes defining the scope is the one that is missed, and then that's the one that's going to cost us dearly down the road. And that's why it's important. And in many instances, scope management tend to be viewed as an exclusive technical area. That means exclusive means only a few people can just say, okay, this is what we want. This exclusivity has some issue, because you need to identify the end users. You need to identify people who have impact on that project, who are impacted on that project. So you need to kind of gather requirement from a broader resources than an exclusive 1 or 2 people on that project. Of course, many projects fail due to lack of proper scope management, because the steps for defining, gathering, and documenting scopes are pretty much started a few years or maybe like a few decades ago. So lack of proper scope management is another reason why project failed, and then why it's also important. The other area that we need to discusses that the major project issue come from scope creep and gold plating. These are the two important concepts that project managers should know, because not be able to capture the scope properly, that brings scope creep. And gold plating is another term that is used to give beyond and above the scope of the project to the customer. And both of them have an impact on your project scope. Of course, of all the features requested by customers, only 52% made into the final product, because project managers gather those requirements, but those requirements did not go through all the way for several reasons. Either they may not have proper information, they may not have the specification needed that, or they may probably be not being properly ranked. So that's why you see that in projects, scope management is important. Now, the last piece is the rework needed to correct the requirements errors can account for as much as 50% of the total project cost, which is what we call it the cost of change. And sometimes we also call it a cost of mistakes, because if you made that mistakes during requirement gathering, then the cost goes all the way down. I remember in my previous classes, I have learned from my own student that, this big construction projects, critical piece like the elevator and other pieces are missing during the initial design. And then by the time when the project is like on the 5th or 6th floor, then the scope of that cost of mistake is astronomically high. So that is where you have the very important pieces for the project. So you need to know exactly what is needed for. All right. So now we know that these are like a few points among many that tell us why scope management is important. Okay, now what you see here is the cost of mistakes. That means in a perfect world where all the requirement mistakes are eliminated, means that then all project budget can be cut by 50%. So what you see here is that, the cost against time chart, where during that initiation, the cost is slow and then small, and then during planning, it goes a little bit high. And by the time when it goes to execution and then, closing, the scope goes up. So that means that if we don't identify our mistakes at the beginning, the project mistake, the cost of fixing or cost of correction is going to be huge. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of research studies and then show you the data why we are focusing on scope. Because Standish Group, it's one of the respected consulting group in Boston, they published the what we call it chaos report. On the chaos report, they surveyed close to like 40,000 project managers and then project owners, and they found out that this finding or not be able to do scope management properly is costing the projects in a big way. So this Standish Group, the finding at some point said that 66% of projects fail. It means almost 2 in 3 projects fail. When we say fail, they either be completed, under over budgets, or maybe way behind schedule. And they identified almost 8 reasons why their project failed. And to your surprise, 5 of the 8 top reasons why project failed has to do with scope. Means that has to do with the requirement, and requirement is part of the scope. Let's just visit each one of them. First one is incomplete requirements. So if you don't get the requirement, if you don't exhaust the requirements from the beginning all the way to the end, if you miss one piece of the requirement, of course, the project is going to be, in trouble. Of course, lack of user involvement, because oftentimes we have several projects that are completed on time, even under budget, but they still sit on the shelf and just, on the shelf on the desk, because if you are not using, involving the user, the end users, they will be the number one to tell you that how your project is not working. So lack of user involvement in collecting requirement is another reason why those projects fail. Of course, unrealistic customers' expectations, because you as a project manager, your role is to temper customers' expectation and then tell them the truth. When you're going to deliver, when the project is delivered, what the project should have. So if setting a realistic goal is always the best strategy. Of course, changing requirement and specification every time. Why we are kind of sensitive on this, especially on construction, on those predictive type of projects where you have certain activities performed before you move to the next one, or sometimes we call them a kind of a step, or a waterfall. Changing the requirement in the middle of the game has a cost. Of course, we're not saying that we cannot, but by all means, avoid to change requirements once you start your project. Of course, customer no longer need to the feature provided. That's another reason why project fail. That means you will be, you will have a situation where customers, they say, well, I don't need this. So you build that product, you spend your time, you spend your hours, and then it's all of a sudden now obsolete. So imagine that 5 out of 8 reasons why 66% of projects fail is because of requirements. Now let's just go one step deep and then just take the first one, only the first one, and then see what made the project's requirement incomplete. So there's another data that was out, reason for incomplete requirement. There are close to 6 reasons, and the number one, the biggest one, 49% of the reason why requirements are incomplete are incorrect facts. That means that the project manager did not do his or her due diligence finding the actual information. And of course, 19% or 29% of the reason for incomplete requirement is omission. Means that you may say that, well, this is not important, and this is so if you omit one key component, then it will probably cost you down the road, because it has to do with the completeness of the project. Of course, inconsistency is another 13% of the reason why requirements are incomplete. And inconsistency means that you need to have the wording of the customer. You need to kind of verify and validate what they actually want to have. Of course, ambiguity, they're not sure. So if they're not sure, they're just like shooting in the dark. And they may probably come back, well, I said this, but I'm not sure if that's true. Okay? And of course, misplaced requirements and then others. So you can see that, from the higher level, 5 out of 8 reasons for project failures are requirement. And one of the 5 reasons for that requirement is lack of or incomplete requirement. And you can have like multiple reasons why your project is in danger because of lack of requirements. All right, now the next step here, this slide is a very interesting slide because that will tell us why we need to invest more time and cost in scope management. There's a fascinating data out on that. And when you see the chart, it's the percentage of cost overrun against the percentage of investment in scope definition. Remember that concept, garbage in, garbage out? So if you don't invest in your requirements, if you don't take time to capture your requirements, if you don't take time to talk to the customer, to verify and validate what actually they want, then your cost is astronomically high at the end, because at the end of the day, all those correction and then other areas have an impact. So this is the interpretation of the table. Now, companies that spend less than 5% of the total project cost, because there's kind of a room where you may say between like 10 to 20%, 10 to 15% of your time and energy should be spent in collecting requirement and doing that. So then comparing with that, 5% of companies that spend less than 5% of the total project cost, requirement elicitation, will experience cost overrun of between 80 to 200%. It's like a huge gap. That means that if you just spend a little more, then you're gonna avoid less cost overrun, because the majority of cost overrun comes from lack of proper requirement and scope definition. Now, on the other side, companies that invested between 8 to 14% of their total project cost on requirement collection and had a cost overrun of less than 60%. So what you see here is that you may still have in a situation when you have a cost overrun, but if you put your requirement, if you put more time, more energy in your requirements, then your cost overrun is significantly less. We're talking about from 80 to 200% to less than 60%. So the rule of thumb is spend between 8 to 14% of your project cost in defining, verifying, ranking, and then doing all your projects scope management. All right, now let's just move on to the next section where you can see, go and then review a project or go and then probably like monitor an organization. You may probably see how their maturity level in terms of scope management is. So this slide will show you that there are some signs that an organization has a poor scope management techniques. And those signs are as follow. So the first one is now, even the high-level project goals are never clearly defined. High level means that it's just at the inception level, at the initiation level. If you don't define those requirement, then that's like the first sign where your project is doomed to fail. The second part is customers are too busy to participate in the process of requirement elicitation. That means if usually project managers schedule time to talk to the customer. If the customer keep on pushing away your invitation, if they are too busy to participate, that means they are not telling you what they want. That means you don't have the right information to move on to the next step. So this is a sign where you have to pay attention that how the project management is, working or function. The other one is a lot of people who are not actual customers or users speak and provide requirements on the customer's behalf. That's common. Sometimes we call them a proxy, requirement or system owners. They don't tell you the full picture. So it's always good to listen from the horse mouth. Means that it's always good to get direct information from them. So if you see that, the third party or people who have barely has to do with the product come and tell you this is what we want, then this is another sign that your organization is not doing the right procedure. The other one is product scope exists in the heads of experts and it's not written down. So this is common. You may go and meet with one or two technical folks. They have everything in their mind and they tell you exactly what they want to have. And if you don't document them, or if you don't ask to have it in writing, then you're going to miss it. Remember that movie, Lost in Translation? That means that, if you don't get the right information, then you started writing your own story, which is oftentimes end up in the wrong way. So this is another sign. And all products or features are, according to customers, whether real or surrogates, they are equally important. So, if you kind of put everybody on the same table, not prioritizing what, who are the key resources who are going to give you the information, and that's also a sign of a poor performance on your project. Of course, another one is the technical team members discover missing or ambiguous information in the documents, and then they have to guess. Instead of going back and validate, they say, you know what, he meant this. So let's just do this. So that is also not a good sign of maturity of proper project scope management within your organization. Of course, technical team members and customers frequently focus on what the product should look like and its functionality is ignored. That means if you're kind of looking at the end result, oftentimes people are, the technical folks are focusing on the technical part, but at the end of the day, your product, especially in IT or another area, the layman or the standard people are using it. That means that they care more on the functionality of your project than the technical complexity of your project. So pay attention to more of that functionality, and of course keep the technical discussion behind the scene, but the primary purpose of getting and working with your customers are getting their functionality requirements. So that's another sign that your organization's scope management is not mature enough. How about this? So customer either do not sign off the requirements or design documents or provide their sign on and then change their minds all the time. So this is kind of important. If you have a client who flip-flop, they tell you something today and then they just change their mind, then they're like in a roller coaster. You are kind of getting that information, start your work, and the next time when you go there, oh no, I didn't mean this, I want this. So just pay attention. Those customers who keep on changing the narrative or the story. The company does not have proper requirement specifications, requirement management plan, requirement traceability metrics, and the work breakdown structure. Now, this means that the company or your project team, doesn't have the proper maturity of project scope management. If you see here, then there is a problem. So these are like some of the signs that your scope management within an organization is mature or not. Okay. The last one is like, your project scope changes or increase and time, resource, and budget stay the same. I mean, this is clear. This is one of the typical example, because every time you see the customer, he or she comes in and say, hey, gee, can you just add this? Can you just, add that? But they already signed in one cost, and then in a specific, they expect you to deliver on time. So that means if you start seeing customer come left and right and change their requirements, but they don't change, or they don't probably adjust their costs and then their schedule, then there is another sign that you have a very poor project scope management procedure. So what we have discussed in the last 2 slides are about 10 signs where you can sense the maturity of your project scope management practice within an organization. There are a couple of maturity level assessment procedures out here, not particularly for project scope management, but as a whole, the project management maturity level 1 means that the project team is kind of in the infancy stage, and then 2 kind of picks some tools and techniques, and it goes on. I think level 5 is the project team is mature and they know what they do. They know what they expect when they go and they meet the customer. So this is part 1 of the introduction to projects scope management. And let's now move to the history of scope management, which is the history of project management. Now, when you talk about the history of scope of project management, one thing that we need to really careful is that projects did not start 100 years ago. Projects have been there as long as humankind was there, thousands and thousands of years. And they did not have a proper procedure, but they were able to fix and then build magnificent symbol that we also are proud here, here like in Ethiopia with the Lalibela crossings, the Aksum, obelisk, and then similar projects. So the history of project management dated back to 1,000 years. And I think one of the authors actually described that maybe like, 100,000 BC to even, that means that it's way back when the human being invent their hammer and their knife. That's a project. And it's like 2,700 years BC, which is the first true pyramids of Egypt. And then you can start see that like 80 AD, where the Roman finished their building their Colosseum, where it's now like the symbol of the, if you go to Rome, then you can see that, it's almost, a symbolic structure. And then it goes on and on until 1987, or maybe until 1969, where the PMBOK guide was established by Project Management Institutes. So if you see here, the history of project management means the history of scope management, because whenever we talk about project, we're also talking about scope. And this goes all the way back to the pretty much the establishment of humankind. So why didn't we learn how to manage properly, or to manage properly, considering that this project has the history of like 100,000 years? I think the problem is, yes, but there are a couple of things that were not there that we have now, and then we're still struggling. So this is just to give you an idea of where the project started, and then how the project management started, the management of the project started, because once the PMBOK was developed, then you start to see some improvements on the rate of project failure, and start to see some improvements on how we manage the projects. Okay, so enough about the history and about why scope management is important. So let's just move to part 2 of this module 1. This is where we talk about the first process, one of the 6 processes identified in project scope management by PMI in its PMBOK, which is the plan scope management. So we're going to discuss about the inputs, tools, and techniques available on for this process. So key concept of project scope management, we talked about that, but we also need to identify the difference between project scope and product scope. So there's a difference between project and product. Project has a limited time, the beginning and the end, and then it's unique, and then also produce some form of service or product, and then a product, on the other hand, has everything except that it's not unique. So when you say about the product scope, this is the feature and the functions that characterize a product, a service, or a result. That means that the features mean what is included in that product. The project scope, on the other side, is the work performed to deliver a product, a service, or result with the specified features and functions. Because whenever we talk about project scope, is sometimes viewed as including the product scope, because at the end of the day, you may probably produce a product, but the process of delivering that is this a project. Completion of a project scope is measured against what? Is the project management plan, while completion of the product scope is measured against the product requirements. So just the reason why we brought this concept is that we need to make sure that we don't mix the 2 concepts together. The term requirement is defined as a condition or capability that's required to be present in a product, service, or result to satisfy an agreement or other formal imposed specifications. So requirement means what you are about to deliver to the customer. Okay, now every time we talk about project scope management, there are a couple of things that come to mind. The first one is the trends in scope management. What are the emerging practice? Because as the technology changes, so does the project process. And of course, consideration to agile, because agile project management is pushing the industry in a different direction. So these are kind of concepts that we need to discuss here. So trends and emerging practice in project scope management shows that some of them started focusing on collaborating with business analyst professionals, because in requirement gathering, you need to have different skill sets. You need to have the business analyst, you need to have requirement gathering specialist, you need to have, technical writer, you need to have technical architect. So it's kind of a collaboration tool, because this process determines problem and identify business needs. If you bring the business analyst, identify and recommend viable solutions for meeting those needs, of course, and elicit documents and manage stakeholders' requirements in order to meet business and project objectives, and of course, facilitate the successful implementation of product and service. So It's important. Tailoring means that you have your project scope and you have different industries. You know, we have construction industries, we have service industries, hospitality industry, IT, defense, and government, and all of them takes what is needed for them. That means that it literally tailor their own specific needs. That means that, you know, knowledge and requirement management, the validation and control of their product. So kind of specific to their own area. Stability and some of the governance are also part of the tailoring strategy, which I have, I think, additional information on that. Of course, consideration for agile, because gathering requirement in traditional project is totally different from requirement in agile, even from the term. In the traditional, we call it requirement gathering. In the agile, we call it like, you know, user story development. So depending on the type of project you have, then you are actually using that specific technical jargons on that area. So tailoring consideration has all this detailed information. The knowledge and requirement management, you may probably ask, does the organizations have formal or informal learning management? Because knowledge, you know, create knowledge process group process was actually added on the 6th edition of the PMBOK, because PMI also recognized, and in the industry, that creating and capturing knowledge is one critical piece for the success of the project. Validation and control is another one. Does the organization have existing formal and informal validation process? That's one piece. You know, how is the development approaches? How stable is the requirement gathering process? And then, of course, you know, governance that will put everything into that frame. And when you talk about your scope, then you also need to talk about how you tailor your process to fit exactly what you want for your industry, or for your sector, or even for your specific company. All right, now let's just move on to the first process where we started plan for our scope, which is now plan scope management, because everything starts with planning, and you have an exercise on that. And the plan scope management will help organizations to kind of put together a step forward for managing their scope, which is what you see is here. Plan scope management is the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. It also provides guidance on how the scope will be managed throughout the project, because this is like a living document. You're not going to finish everything at the beginning, even though the majority of the scopes are developed and then captured at the beginning. But as you move on, things may change, requirement may vary. So this is the process where you can use to plan. And like the PMI process, to do all this, you have certain inputs and to send techniques, and then outputs. And of course, the inputs has to do with, you know, having a proper written and approved project charter, which is very important. Of course, having the project management plan, and then some of the external and internal factors within your organization. Sometimes they call them enterprise environmental factor. That's the factor that you don't have any control except accepting them and then using them. For example, if you build a construction site, then the zoning is not your, you know, your decision. So the city council will say that, okay, this zone requires this. So this is like, you know, an external factor. Of course, we need to use expert judgment and data analysis for planning our scope. And of course, you know, as a PM, of course, you know, 90% of your time spent communicating then you spend a lot of time in meeting with your customer, meeting with your client, meeting your boss, meeting your project team, meeting your compliance officer, meeting with the government, with all stakeholders. Then your output is your scope management plan. And of course, you have another plan called the requirement management plan. And by week 2, you will also use these inputs, tools, and techniques to develop your selected projects. Okay, so now what are the inputs for that project plan? We talked about the project management plan, the charter, the enterprise factor, organizational culture, because the culture of organization will determine what type of project you can pursue. And then the culture has also something to do with your organizational structure, whether it's 100% functional team, or it's 100% projectized project, or anything in between. We have about 8 different types of structures. Of course, you know, the infrastructure of your organization, your personal administration, the marketplace, and all of these lists. So these are the inputs, and the tools and techniques are expert judgment and data analysis. So there is a reading section in this module where you will spend time in data analysis, because you need that in order to build your project. And those data analysis includes like requirement gathering techniques, you know, the different type of you know, tools, and also interviewing methods, group discussion, and then also, you know, the focus group, and you know, other additional information. Of course, the meeting is another one. And the output of your scope management plan need to have scope management plan, which is the process of preparing a detailed project scope. And then the process that enables the creation of work breakdown structure, the process that specifies how formal acceptance are completed. Of course, you also need to have your requirement management plan. In your requirement management plan, the project team will determine how requirements activities will be planned, tracked, and then reported. There is a piece that we're going to discuss that talked about the traceability metrics, tracing a requirement from the time when that requirement is created all the way to you said it's done. Of course, configuration management, and some of the requirement prioritization process, and some of the product metrics, and the traceability structure. So this is pretty much what we have for introduction to project scope management. We have plenty of reading materials, and so you need to also, there's of course some required reading. And once you are done with that, and then you can go ahead and then participate in the discussion forum session. And of course, you will start spending more time with your team members to build your project and submit your project on time. So like what I said, this is a very intensive class. It requires a lot of thought process to put together what you're supposed to submit. And I expect that you are going to do well. And if there's any question, you let us know. And again, I wish you all the best.